We are getting started this morning in the Gospel of Luke. And we all recognize that name Luke. It's a common one chosen by English speakers. We recognize it from his Gospel account. But we're going to take a few minutes to learn more of what we can from the Scriptures about Luke, the writer, who this person was. The name Lucas That name Lucas is not found in the Old Testament. It's not an Old Testament name. It is related to our English word lucid. Our English word lucid. Okay? In this case, it means something like light or giving light. Okay, providing light is the idea behind that name Lucas that is given to the evangelist. Let's turn to St. Paul's letter to the Colossians. Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. To start learning about this fellow we call Luke. Colossians, say again?
Is it in the book of Luke?
No, Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. So this is a letter of St. Paul to the Colossians. Chapter 4, verse 14 is where we're headed. And it gives us a little insight into who Luke is. Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. Would somebody like to read that for us?
Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas.
Demas. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what title does St. Paul give to Luke here?
Physician.
Physician. Yeah. The Bible doesn't teach us an awful lot about Luke, not in its direct kind of a way. This is one of the more famous passages describing St. Luke, and it calls him a physician. Now, when we start reading his writings, one of the things that leaps off the page at you is that Luke was obviously well educated. And well educated in Greek.
Yeah.
He's a native Greek speaker. Okay? He's got an ability with Greek that many of the other writers in the New Testament do not have. Okay? Many of the New Testament writers will express themselves in what I'd call like a marketplace Greek. They learned Greek to go shopping, to get around in the marketplace and stuff like that, but they're not what you'd call highly or well educated. Luke has that kind of training. He writes more of a style it's more like classical Greek. And early church fathers noticed this about Luke as they were more familiar with that language. And as they started reading and comparing the Gospels, they were like, well, this guy's got an education. He uses words and such and expresses himself in ways that would be familiar with them. He was a cultured Greek. Both Jerome and Eusebius, these are two early Christian writers about the Bible and history. They talk about Luke and they affirm that he was a physician. They say that's what St. Paul calls him there is correct. Let's go to the Gospel of Luke. Look at Luke 22, verse 44. Luke chapter 22, verse 44. When someone has that, read it out. I'm getting a bottle of water.
22, what was the verse?
Verse 44. 22, 44.
And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground.
So here is an insight into what Jesus was experiencing. The agony that he is undergoing as he is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is an actual medical condition. This is something that can actually happen to people. It has to do with stress. Okay, what happens is the person is so stressed that the blood vessels underneath the skin break. And then that blood mingles with the sweat and then comes out the pores. Okay? High stress. Have you ever seen, I'll give you another example that's maybe akin to this. Have you ever seen somebody who, you see them and they've got a bloodshot eye? The eye looks like somebody socked them. Yeah. Okay, but nobody hit them. A blood vessel in that eye has failed and broke, and the blood gets in the eye. And it's something like that, but in this case, in the skin. Jim?
That could be due to drinking whiskey, too.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that, Jim. Thanks for the warning.
No, I've noticed a lot of people work. They drink too much.
Okay, and that would happen with them. Okay, yeah. In Jesus' case, it has to do with stress. Has to do with stress. And Luke, perhaps as a physician, he's the only one that records this, and he makes a record of it. He maybe had an interest in this that the other gospel writers did not, and records this as a physician. So there we might be seeing an example of his medical knowledge influencing what he records from the Gospels. We know that Luke was a companion of Paul, that they traveled together and spent time together, and we know this from several passages in the book of Acts. And I'm going to take you there next. I'm going to write down 3 different passages. If you're on this side of the poll, I want you to look up one passage. If you're at the back tables there in the center here, I'm going to have you look up a second passage. And then this group right over here, I'm going to have you look up a third passage. Let me write those on the board so everybody can see where we're headed. So the first passage is Acts chapter 16, and we're looking at verses 11 to 17. The second is Acts chapter 20 verse 5, and it runs to 21:18. We're not going to read all these verses, but I wanted you to see them. And then 27:1 through 28:16. So group over on this side, you're at Acts 16. The back tables here, you're at 20, starting at verse 5. And then to this side over here, looking at 27 verse 1. And what I think we'll do is just have you read just the first verse in each of these passages. That'll probably be enough, but I wanted you to see the full reference. Would someone over here read for us the first passage? He's looking. Okay.
So setting sail from
Troas, yes.
We made a direct voyage to
Samothrace.
Thank you. And the following day to Neapolis.
Very good. Okay. What you're going to find as you read in this passage is that they all have throughout this passage you'll find the word we. The word we. And what's happening there is Luke has joined Paul as a companion, and he's writing about a shared experience, what we've done together. And he was a traveling companion with Paul when this was happening, and he, whether intentionally or not, makes a record of this in the Gospels by referring to we, that time they had together. Next passage, chapter 20, someone read verse 5.
He's going before tarried for us at Taros.
For us. Okay, there's an us in that case. I was listening for we.
That's the next chapter.
That's the next one?
Next one.
Next verse has that?
Yeah.
So once again, it's that traveling information, and because you're getting all those city names as you go. But here he refers to us. They're traveling together. 27 verse 1, if someone would read that over this direction.
And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius.
Okay, thank you. Once again, we were traveling. We were doing this together. These are called the we passages for obvious reasons in the book of Acts. The we passages, and we believe that St. Luke was traveling with Paul at the time that he writes these things. It's a funny thing, when you read like the Gospel of Luke in the early church, there's nothing in the Gospel of Luke that says, I'm Luke and I wrote this. It doesn't say that. Okay? What you find is that at the top of the pages of the manuscripts, it says, according to Luke. It's the gospel according to Luke. So the early scribes knew the tradition that Luke was the author, and they took these notes and wrote this down in those copies of the gospel that they made, and that's how the news of him serving this way has come to us. Okay? As the church. This is true of all the evangelists. They didn't write their own names into the stories. In fact, the Apostle John famously refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Okay, if you've ever noticed that in the Gospels, instead of naming himself. I don't know if it's a humility thing or what it is, but they don't do that. And John says, the disciple whom Jesus loved.
A little bit arrogant.
Maybe arrogant, huh?
But he loved them all.
Of course he did.
Yeah.
Of course he did. There is a closeness and companionship you see in the gospel
Yeah.
with John.
Yeah.
When they have the Last Supper, the person who was sitting next to Jesus, or in that case, not sitting but reclining,
Yeah.
that was right in front of him was John.
Yeah.
So that's a thing we notice in the Gospels. I saw a hand. Go ahead.
Do you think out of the Gospels, Luke's is the most, I think it's the most descriptive?
We're going to look at a passage where he describes to us what he's doing in the
I
Gospel.
wouldn't say it's the most accurate, but it's the most descriptive.
Yeah, I think the Gospel writers, they set different goals for themselves of what they're trying to achieve. For example, Matthew's Gospel, it's all about the sayings of Jesus. He has large passages. There's 5 of them in the Gospel of Matthew where there are long lists of things that Jesus says. So that's his focus. That's what he wants to write about. Mark is trying to give us a fast action kind of account. He jumps over all the story of Jesus' birth, and he goes right to the baptism of John and Jesus as a fulfillment of the prophecies. And he's always saying, Jesus did this, and immediately they did that. And it's much more action-oriented. That's Mark's style and emphasis. John likes to focus on these wild sayings of Jesus that people have to ponder and try to figure out, like, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll build it up again. And everybody's like, what is he talking about? And then John says he's talking about his body. He's talking about his body.
More of a philosopher?
Yeah, but he writes in a very simple style. His style is actually very simple, but the thoughts are kind of deep. They're kind of deep and ponderous. And he loves these sayings from Jesus that are that are hard to understand. So each of them has a different style. We're going to learn more about Luke's style here in just a minute. Go ahead, Kevin.
When I read the Gospel of John, I noticed that in that Gospel, he doesn't give a whole description of how Jesus' birth or anything. He just gets to the point of who Jesus is, and he's the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was
Yeah.
God. So
Yeah,
he got to the point.
Yeah, he mentions the birth of Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He refers to it, but he doesn't try to tell the story like Matthew and Luke
I know it.
tells the stories of Jesus' birth. So they're once again, they're writing with different goals. They're all looking to describe Jesus, who he is and what he's doing, but they do it from different vantage points and different styles. Yeah, and that's one of the neat things about it when you study the Gospels, seeing those unique approaches that they take. So I wanted you to see those wee passages. Luke is traveling with Paul. He seems to be a companion with Paul. Looks like he becomes a Christian later than the disciples. Okay, he's not among those first disciples. He's one of the later people to come in. Probably not quite what we'd call second generation. But he joins at a later time, maybe through Paul's ministry. And it seems that he's probably a Greek, because of that Greek name and his Greek abilities, his style and capabilities, rather than being Jewish. The other New Testament writers are Jewish in their heritage. Luke is probably a Greek. I'm going to throw up on the board here for you. That's not a happy expression, is it? I'm going to put up on the board here for you an outline. I think I might have to flip this. I think our board doesn't like that one marker. I'm going to put an outline up here of the book for you. Note takers, get ready. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to put up a timeline for you. So 3 BC, the Annunciation to Mary. 2 BC, the birth of Jesus. AD 29, that's the baptism of Jesus. AD 32, that's the time of Jesus' resurrection. And then AD 36, the conversion of Paul. AD 58 to 60, Paul's in prison. We'll explain that a little bit more. AD 68, Paul and Peter, I'm going to put a little cross there. They're martyred. Okay, that's what that cross is standing for. And then AD 70, that's Jerusalem destroyed.
Paul and Peter were martyred, is that what you're saying, Pastor?
Paul and Peter were martyred in 68 AD.
Was Daniel the first one to be martyred?
Daniel is an Old Testament figure, and he does not get martyred. He survives. They throw him in the lion's den,
Okay.
and he gets back out. They let him out the next morning. He's all right.
He intended to be martyred.
Oh yeah, they were trying to do him in. They were trying to do Daniel in, but he escapes. But Peter and Paul, toward the end of their life, they're in prison for preaching the gospel, and they suffer martyrdom. So I'm throwing all of this up on the board here, putting all of this up on the board here, so that we can talk about where the Gospel of Luke fits in, okay, as it tells its story. One of the first events that we're going to see in the Gospel of Luke is right here. The Annunciation, the Holy Spirit and the angel talk to Mary. They communicate with Mary about how Jesus is going to be born. All of the gospel writers include the baptism of Jesus and the resurrection. Those are two of the biggest, most important events in the life of Jesus. They may give you different details along other ways, but some things show up everywhere. And the baptism of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, the crucifixion, of course, as well, would show up there. You see how long it was from the time that Jesus rose from the dead to the time Paul becomes a Christian. It's just about 4 years. It's pretty early on. And he's regarded as an apostle because of that direct call of Jesus. We've already talked about the we passages, right? Of Luke being a companion. So sometime after this, Luke becomes a Christian and becomes connected with Paul and his ministry. It's likely sometime after that. The book of Acts ends with this: Paul being in prison. He's in prison in Rome. People are coming and going. He's under house arrest. So they have a chance to share the gospel even though he can't leave the house. He's able to do this. And that's how Luke ends his book. He ends it with Paul being in prison there. I'm going to finish 2 points and I'm going to come to you, Stephen. I've already mentioned the martyrdom, the death of Peter and Paul. Does anybody remember how Peter died?
Upside down.
Crucified upside down. We know that from early Christian historians. I think it's first mentioned by a guy named Hegesippus, and then it's quoted again in Eusebius' writings that we're studying at the home Bible studies. He was crucified upside down. The reason that happened, they say, is because Peter didn't want to die in the same way that Jesus did. He didn't feel worthy to be treated that way. I can't imagine being crucified, much less being crucified upside down.
That's what I was just thinking.
That would be
Well, just to be crucified, period.
yeah. It's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Terrible thing. I can't if I hang upside down for long, I get a headache.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Good for you.
It's not right for you. Yeah.
Wasn't that all of them?
Weren't they all done that way?
Down?
No.
No, just Peter. It's only recorded of Peter. There's different records on how the different apostles die, but Peter's the only one upside down. What's that?
Some of them stoned to death?
I think so. Does anybody know how Paul was killed?
He was beheaded.
He was beheaded. The reason, do you know?
He's a Roman citizen.
He was a Roman citizen. So if you were a Roman citizen, they got it over quick, right? If you were not, they wanted you to suffer. And they would leave you up there. You could be on a cross for days, which is hard to imagine. I think there are records of people being up like 3 or more days, hanging on a cross, depending on how healthy they were when they went up. Pretty bad. Stephen, you had your hand up.
Yeah, explain the birth of Jesus 2 years before Christ.
Oh, yes. So in the Middle Ages, what we call the distinction between BC and AD, that was introduced in the Middle Ages. AD stands for Anno Domini, year of our Lord. And then BC would be before Christ, is the idea. The guy who did the calculations got it wrong. So instead of being born in 1 AD, the historians who have studied this, and the basis of it has to do with Herod the Great and his reign, which is mentioned in the Gospels. they calculate that Jesus was likely born in what we call 2 BC. So that's how that came about. Sometimes we have trouble counting. These things happen. But there's an outline. I've talked with you about how Luke is converted somewhere in here. He shows up and becomes a Christian, most likely somewhere in there. He's writing the book of Acts, finishing that up here. He doesn't tell us about the martyrdom of Peter and Paul or the destruction of Jerusalem, which is the biggest event. One of the biggest events for early Christians. None of the gospel writers tell us about that event. They refer to it through prophecies of Jesus. Jesus prophesied this was going to happen, and he warns the Christians ahead of time. But that's as much as the gospel writers tell us about that event. What we know about it, we know from a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. Josephus. He was involved in those wars. He ends up fighting on the side of the Romans, and he writes a big book about what happened there in Jerusalem and how terrible it was when all of that took place, as Jesus had forewarned the Christians. So somewhere in this range, Luke wrote his gospel. It's somewhere in that time period that Luke writes his gospel. We're going to be talking about how does Luke know about all of this over here? And he gives us a lot of detail about it. How does he know all of that if he only becomes a Christian so much later?
Prior writings?
Prior writings? Yeah, well, we'll be talking about it. We're going to be looking together at what he says on the topic as we go. But, yeah, Luke is writing somewhere in this time period here, it would seem. Let's see. I mentioned the prophecies of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's now go to the beginning of Luke's gospel, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, and we'll get a picture of how he's going about the writing of the gospel. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4.
Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent
Theophilus.
that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught.
Okay, thank you. Why is Luke writing this? What's he up to?
Make sure we know what we were taught is true.
Okay, now you're using we, like he uses we in Acts.
We, all of us.
Okay, it comes down to we, but who does he write to start with? A guy named Theophilus. Is it OS or US?
U.S.
US. Theophilus. So he's writing this for, so it would seem, an individual believer. Why does he write this for Theophilus? What is it Theophilus is interested in? Or what's Luke interested in giving Theophilus?
The beginning.
Okay? He's going to be telling him the beginning.
Having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you.
Okay? So he wants to tell things from the beginning. He wants to provide the truth. He wants to provide an orderly account.
Perfect understanding.
Okay, he's got a goal for Theophilus as a reader, doesn't he? That he would have a perfect understanding of what has happened. So, and these are all things that Mark anticipated. This is all for us too. And it's right. It's true. The benefits that he was trying to give to Theophilus become the benefits to the church down to this day, almost 2,000 years later. He's trying to give an account from the beginning. He's not like Mark, right? Mark jumps right in at Jesus' baptism. Not this Mark, not this Mark. the Mark and the gospel writer. He jumps right in at Jesus' baptism. Luke wants to back up, and he goes even back a little beforehand. He digs in a little bit as he tells his story. The goal is he wants this Theophilus to know the truth. He's doing things in an orderly way. Okay, he's paying special attention to the history maybe, in a way that the other gospel writers, I mentioned Matthew. Matthew likes to tell, here's all these things that Jesus said. And he seems to be not quite as focused on giving things in a chronological order. Luke might be doing that. He might be more focused on that topic. And then the result, the long-range result, is a perfect or complete understanding. We read the gospel in church, don't we? We are always reading that gospel in church. In fact, in the Lutheran tradition, when we're reading the gospel, what do? We stand up, okay, in honor of the Lord and the gospel. It's a custom we have going back to earlier centuries in the church that we've retained. How long would it take to get through an entire gospel for reading it on Sunday mornings?
Take a little while.
It depends on what's that?
You know, sometimes you might get done like by Monday.
By Monday, okay. If some of the readings are long, you mean? Yeah. So we cut them up into sections and read them at a time. If you've noticed in the current lectionary, the way it's set up, there's a year A, a year B, and a year C. In year A, we are reading the Gospel of Matthew. In year B, which is our current year we're in, we're reading the Gospel of Mark. And in year C, we're reading Luke. We're reading Luke. And then John gets tucked in all over the place. Okay? Usually in the Easter season, he's coming in there, and they need it. Mark's not as long, so they're tucking in more in the year of that Mark is read with things from the Gospel of John. So it takes a while to get through the story of Jesus' life and teachings. And Theophilus, he might be a new believer, and he's learning about Jesus and who he is and what he's done, but he's probably getting it piecemeal. He's getting it piece by piece on Sunday mornings when the people are gathered together, and he's like, I can't keep all this straight. Can you help me out, Luke? And that's likely the reason that Luke writes his gospel, to give that orderly, full account that will give Theophilus a perfect understanding. Yes?
Have you ever noticed in life that some people that are supposedly more intelligent are harder to convince?
That can happen. That can happen.
They're not as easily adopted.
Yes.
That you're trying to present.
Yeah. So Jesus says he encourages us to have the excuse me. He encourages us to have the faith of a little child, to be like a little child, to believe the things of God. So yeah, that is something that happens for sure. Jim.
I was thinking because he's a physician, he would go down all these, he would be more specific than other people.
Oh, yeah. There's maybe a little bit of he's working the organization maybe a little bit more. Yeah, that could be. He says he's going to give an orderly account. So you can order things by time, you can order things by topic, can't you? There's different ways to order them. But Luke's goal, he says, is to be orderly, whatever that organizing principle is. for his teaching here.
Did he just come across Theophilus? Because he's an emperor too. Theophilus is an emperor, so did he just, in his travels, come across?
Yeah, we actually don't know that Theophilus was an emperor.
Okay.
He's probably a person of some importance because Luke has gone out of his way to do this. Sometimes when we had an author writing a book, the person that they attribute it to is called a patron, and they pay for the process and the distribution of the writing. So it's possible that Theophilus is such a person. He would be a man of wealth and means. Books back then were so much more expensive than books are today. We're used to running off 1,000 copies of something without too much trouble. Back then, everything's being done by hand, so it's very expensive and time-consuming. Let's break down this name a little bit and talk about it. It breaks down into two different words. Two different words. I gotta keep my pronunciation going here. The first part is theo, which is the Greek word for God, not Teddy. Okay, like Teddy Roosevelt. No. The second part, philos, is the word for love or friend. Okay, depending on how it's being used. So the name means a lover of God. A lover of God. And then we start wondering, well, is that his real name, or is it like a title? Or is it like a title for this person? He's writing to someone who is a lover of God, and he's not giving us the exact name. The church doesn't record that in its history. We don't know for sure.
Also sounds Greek.
It also sounds Greek, absolutely. This is a Greek name. So it's Luke, who's probably a Greek, writing to another Greek, and writing in a style that he will appreciate. I mentioned St. Jerome. He's the guy that translated the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into Latin about 4 centuries later than this. And he was well trained in classical writing. He knew his Latin and his Greek really, really well, well-educated man. And he looks at Luke's writing and he goes, this guy's like me. This guy's well-educated. Not like the other gospel writers who are writing that marketplace Greek. Not as well done. So whoever Theophilus was, he was probably also a well-educated guy. He might have been a patron. He might have been paying for this writing of the gospel. And it seems also that he's fairly new to the faith. So he has to learn all of this about Jesus and who Jesus is. Kevin?
So are we suggesting that Theophilus is an alias to a person, or I mean, it could be his name, but it's like an alias?
Yeah, it could be his name, or it could be like a title, that he's a lover of God. There's another expression in the New Testament. They call people God-fearers. God-fearers. And that was a Gentile who believed in the God of Israel and wanted to worship him. In Acts, there's a fellow by the name of Cornelius. He's a Roman centurion. He's not been circumcised. He's not become a member of the Jewish faith, but he fears God. And so it's that kind of, it may be that kind of a title. Could be a name, could be a title. So yeah, very good. Questions or comments about what we're seeing here with this Luke? We're getting a picture of who Luke is, aren't we? By looking at some of these details in the book. Yeah.
Let's say at this point he's not a Christian.
Theophilus?
Yeah, no, Luke.
Luke. Well, when he writes this, he is a Christian.
Oh, he is a Christian.
Yeah, he's a companion and...
Let's say, because all of the points for being a Christian is the way it's written.
Yes. Yeah, he's a companion and co-worker with St. Paul,
Okay.
from what we can tell. Yeah. Very good. let's look at those opening words now. We've talked a little bit about them. We're going to look at them a little more closely again. I'll read them this time. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. So other people have been writing this story, right? Other people have been writing the gospel story. He might be referring to people like Matthew and Mark. Maybe John, but John we think wrote later. We think John wrote closer to the end of the first century, from what we know of his history. But at least Matthew and Mark, and there may have been others who were writing things down that weren't preserved for us by the early church. Let's see, verse 2. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. So you see the source of the material, right? You see the source of the gospel account. He's trying to go and find out these eyewitnesses, people who actually were there and saw these things and heard them and could testify about them. So Luke tells us the story of the birth of Jesus. Who would be a good eyewitness for that? Mary, right? There wouldn't be a better eyewitness than Mary for what had happened. And we'll see that Luke gives us a lot of detail about the birth of Jesus. And it sounds like maybe he sat down and interviewed Mary and talked with her about her experience and recorded that at the beginning of his gospel. Yeah.
That's why I said Pastor, he's more descriptive, because he wants it to be people to have it ring true. More so than just what you say, flea market Greek.
Yeah. The flea market Greek. Yeah. He's trying to give an accurate, faithful account.
So people believe it.
And yes, and he's going to the eyewitnesses, because you can't get better testimony than that, can you? You want to hear from the person who was there.
And the mother.
And the mother would be ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah, for this early stuff in particular. For later stuff, when Jesus is traveling and teaching, who would be ideal witnesses to that? God, yes, God sees everything.
The disciples.
The disciples, okay, the disciples walking with Jesus, hearing his teaching. He may be interviewing some of those folks and getting information from them. The early church tells us that, for example, Mark's gospel is influenced by the preaching of Peter. It tells us that Peter is a witness behind what's in the Gospel of Mark. So yeah, go to the eyewitnesses if you want a faithful account of what happened. Verse 3, it seemed good to me also. So I'm following the example of these other writers, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. He's treating him like a dignitary, isn't he? That gives us another picture of this Theophilus. He's some sort of a dignitary. Verse 4, that you may have certainty concerning the things that have been taught. We want you to be certain, okay? Assurance of faith. When you read and study the word of the Lord, I think that's maybe why God had the church record 4 Gospels. As if to say, folks, there's a lot of things in this book you can read, and it's all good, but read about Jesus. Read about Jesus and know about him most surely. That's Jesus is that heart and soul, the center of our Christian faith. So there we've got some of the opening words there about what Luke is up to. Luke records a number of important themes in his gospel. He does some things that are a little different from what the other writers are up to. Let's have somebody read verses 8 to 11. We're going to see one of these themes that comes up in Luke, 8 through 11.
Now, while he was serving as priest before God when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense.
Okay, what's the location here that Luke is describing in this early part of his gospel?
Temple of the Lord.
He's talking about the temple. He's talking about the temple. And one of the priests, right, serving in the temple. This is a theme that comes up repeatedly in Luke's gospel. We'll see it especially in the birth narrative. And then Jesus shows up and teaches in the temple later on in his life. So Luke has a special interest in the activities of the temple. That's one of the themes we have in the Gospel of Luke. Let's have somebody now read, oh dear, jump to chapter 8, Luke chapter 8, and read verses 1 through 3. Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3.
Soon afterward he went on through the cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him, and also women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalena, for whom 7 demons had gone out, and Jonathan, and wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who proclaimed for them out of their means.
Okay, so here we have a couple lists that are given to us by Luke. He lists or talks about the ministry of the disciples. No surprise there, right? All the gospel writers do that. But he gives us something here that the other gospel writers don't do. What's he give us?
Women who were attending.
Party, the people that's with him.
It's a list of women. There's a list of women here that traveled with Jesus and the disciples and talks about their role, doesn't he? He's talking about their participation in the activities of Jesus' ministry. We're going to see that Luke has special attention to the women among the early Christians and what they did, okay, how they contributed to the ministry and life of Jesus. So that's another significant theme in the gospel to be watching for and listening for, the place of those women as they also were serving. All right. I'm going to give you one more example. There's some information writing that Luke does that's different from the other evangelists. Go to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. How are we doing on time here? Luke chapter 15, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to look over the chapter and see the different stories or accounts that are in that chapter. When you recognize one, shout it out to me.
One of the most famous was the prodigal son.
Prodigal son, there you go. That's the last one in the list. There's 2 more before it. What are they?
Lost sheep.
The lost sheep
And the lost coin.
and the lost coin. Do you see a theme?
Lost.
Lost.
That's what's lost.
Yeah, he's focused on what's lost and how God came for the purpose of seeking and finding what was lost. We might say all of this points to a theme of mission, the mission of God. Okay, the mission of God to seek out and to save people who are lost from the Lord and His way. So this is another theme that we see coming up in the Gospel of Luke, especially here in chapter 15. You don't find the prodigal son in the other Gospels. That story of Jesus, it only appears in Luke. Yeah.
Is that what it means, you found the lost sheep?
Yeah, a sheep gets separated from the other sheep, and the shepherd goes out and finds that sheep and brings it home. Okay, that's the essence of that parable that Jesus is telling. And the parable of the coin is similar, that somebody drops a coin, rolls under the bed, and the lady of the house goes through. Once again, he's focusing on a woman, isn't he? A woman's efforts in the household. And he goes through and she sweeps the house until she finds that coin. And then she calls the neighbors and said, "Come party with me." I guess it must have been a valuable coin. It must have been a really valuable coin. So there you're getting a picture of some of the themes we're going to see in the Gospel of Luke. When we come back next week, we're going to hear the story of two important women in the early life of Jesus. It's Elizabeth, who becomes the mother of John the Baptist. Very good. And then, of course, Mary. I'll spell it up here this way because of my granddaughter. Yeah, those are related names. Those are kin names. We're going to see that Luke starts out with the story of the women in his gospel and emphasizes that in a way the other writers don't. Matthew tells the story of Jesus' birth, but he's telling it from the perspective of Joseph. The perspective of Joseph. Okay? So they're both telling the story, but they're doing it from different vantage points. Okay? We're going to get the story from Mary and Elizabeth. Let's bow our heads in a prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the witness and testimony of your servant Luke, for the grand way he presents the truth of the life of Jesus, that we might know for certain who Jesus is and what he has done for us and for our salvation. Lord, as we study in these coming weeks, help us to take these truths to heart. Help us also, Lord, to share them with others through Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen.